Welcome to Universal God Message of Peace, and I'm Lee Weissman, and this is Dr. Khalid Zahir, and we're continuing our weekly dialogue, but today we're going to be talking about insides and outsides. To what extent does our outside impact our insides? And so I'm going to kick us off today. I'm going to kick us off today as the guy with the hat on. Um, since and I say that because um like many religious people, I'm carrying a lot of external signs of my religiosity. One of them being this hat on my head, and one of them being the cut of my hair, and one of them being the length of my beard, which actually is quite long. You can't tied up, but it's very long. I have a very long beard, right? And the question is, what does all that mean? That's one question. What does all that mean? Um, and how do we how do we understand that, in a kind of religious Abrahamic perspective? What How do we understand these outside things in relation to the inside things? So I'm going to go in two completely different directions, and then to resolve. I'm going to try to resolve them. So I'll start out by saying that the Torah itself talks a lot about changing ourselves from the inside out. Um, and the word that it uses for our insides is usually the word heart, which sometimes means mind, sometimes it means the emotional center. It always means the core of our being. And very often, there are many, many verses in the Torah that talk about, how the heart can be crooked and how it has to be straightened out, and the importance of getting your heart straight. And the idea being that our behavior is a reflection of what it is that we think and we feel, right? That's what we do on the outside has a lot to do with what's going on inside of us. And that's a major stream. It's a major stream in Torah. Many, many places, especially in the Psalms and in the prophets and everywhere is telling us, fix your heart, right? Attend to your inner self. That Hashem, God, searches all the hearts, and he's able to see into every heart and so forth, and how important it is to get your heart straight, to get your thinking straight, to make sure that what's going to come out of you really comes from what's inside of you. And that's one perspective. And there's another perspective. And that perspective is that, well, wait a second, things really can begin from the outside. So I am going to share with you, we're gonna do a little bit of like deep learning. So Dr. Zahir and I, we're going to do a little bit of deep learning. And so we're going to learn from the Sefer HaChinuch. So this book was written in Spain. One of the few books I think actually written originally in Spain, actually written in Hebrew. The first printed edition was in 1523, but this is much earlier, probably 12th, 13th century. And it was written as really a letter of a father to a son to explain all the commandments of the Torah and the reasons for them. And it's a very ambitious book. So he picks one strange commandment in the Torah. So the Torah is talking about the holiday of Passover, Pesach. So the holiday of Passover is all about commemorating the exodus from Egypt, right? The coming out of Egypt, the miraculous splitting of the sea and everything. And the Jewish people, Bnei Yisrael, coming through, right, coming through the sea and heading off to the Holy Land, and their freedom from slavery and so forth, and really the consolidation of them as a people, all of that. So there's a strange commandment in the Torah. Commandment is that when you make the sacrifice for the Passover sacrifice, don't break the bones of the sacrifice. So after you've sacrificed the animal and then you cook it, actually you barbecue it, you put it into a barbecue, a big pit, and when you're done with it, when you cut it, you make sure that you don't cut it through the bones, you cut it between the joints. So it's a strange commandment, says so in the Torah. And so the Sefer Chinuch asks, what is this about? Like, this is a very strange thing to say. And he points out something else. He says, really, this whole thing about Passover is very strange because you have this special meal. You go and you make a sacrifice, and then you take the animal and you put it into this oven, and you take it out, and people have to eat it together, and and you're supposed to sit in a special way where you lean back and you relax while you eat. And he says there are a lot of details about this meal, including this thing of breaking the bones. So he says, what is it about breaking bones? So he says breaking bones is something that poor people do. He says if you're rich, right? If you're rich, you don't have to break things up into little pieces, right? You can afford to eat a whole lamb shank, right? You can afford to eat a whole lamb shank. You don't have to cut the lamb shank into two. You can afford to eat a whole one. And you don't need to suck the marrow from the bones, right? You don't need that. You can just throw out the bones, right? If you're wealthy. So he said that, and in relation to the cooking, right? It says that you're not supposed to boil the animal. You're supposed to put it in a barbecue and you're supposed to roast it in heat. So he says about that too. He says, well, it's also about wealth, because if you want to make meat last longer, right? If you want it to go further, you take it and you put it into a stew, right? And that way it gives its flavor to the stew, and you can more. But if you put it into an oven, right? It's called a tanur, right? Tandoor. You put it into the tanur, right? What's going to do is going to shrink up, right? It gets smaller. You actually get less. You get less out of it than more out of it. So he says, what is all this stuff about? He says, look, all of this is to make you feel like a free person. The Torah can tell you that you are a free person, that that you were once a slave and now you are free. You once were beholden to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians, and they controlled your life, but now you're a servant of God. You're a servant of God, and you have that freedom. There's a freedom in that. And so the Torah could have lectured us about that, but the Torah didn't lecture us about it, he says it gave us an experience, the experience of eating like a free person, eating like a wealthy person, eating like a king, because the way we feel influences, so the way we act influences the way that we feel. And so he says that if a person is basically, you say, not such a great person. He says bad person, but I'm going to be nice and say not such a good person. Not such a good person. And they do good things. Eventually, those good things will influence them and they will become a better person. So if I'm a stingy person and I force myself to give charity a little bit every day, I accustom myself to giving charity every day, I will eventually become a more charitable person, he says. Alternatively, if I'm by nature a decent person, right? I'm by nature a decent person, and but I behave badly, right? I behave badly. I do something bad, and if I do it habitually, eventually that's going to have an impact on my character, and my character is going to change to bad. So he takes a kind of behaviorist approach, right? And says how we behave says that the mind and the heart follow the action. So we have two different philosophies here. We have one philosophy that the actions follow the mind and the heart, and we have another philosophy that that the mind and the heart follow the actions. And I think that both of them, I think that both of them are true. And it's a question of how we're looking at it. I think in many cases, um, it becomes a kind of loop. Our behavior influences our thinking, which then influences our behavior, which then influences our thinking, which influences our behavior. When it comes to externals, I think externals can have a positive impact, right? So, for example, I cover my head, and I cover my head. Why am I covering my head? It says in the Talmud that a person should be aware that the Shekhinah, God's presence, is over one's head. You should have an awareness that God is always present, and so you cover your head as a reminder, right? As a reminder that God is over you, that you wear certain clothes, that you dress a certain way, just to remind yourself that you're part of God's army, so to speak, that you're wearing a uniform, right? And the uniform reminds you of your mission, right? So when a person is dressed in uniform, they feel a sense of mission, they feel a sense of belonging, and so on. So that can be a positive. That can be a positive. At the same time, so I'm gonna speak, I'll speak really personally. At the same time, there's also the danger that you can start to believe that the clothes make the man, right? You can start to believe that, okay, I wear a big kippah, I wear a big kufi. I must really be I have a big beard. I must be right? I must be really something because I might cut my hair this way or that way. And that can be deceptive, not only to yourself, but also to other people. Right? I mean, the religious uniform can be used, to not only to fool others, but to fool yourself, right? Into believing that you're something you're not. And they have to be very careful about that. It's interesting. So Lale was telling me that her father was mugged by two ladies dressed in jilbab and niqab. Right? So, you know, a religious uniform does not guarantee anything. Um, it definitely does not guarantee anything. That's sort of the way it is. Um, so I think that there's a value to the externals. I think that they can definitely influence the way that the way that we think, and the way that we think influences the way we act. Um, but I think you have to be very careful about not putting too much emphasis on the externals. Um, especially especially when people get interested in religion at first. I think sometimes they often, focus. Uh, you see a guy who last week, he looked like a normal person, right? And this week, he's growing out his beard, and he's got He's got the big kippah. He's wearing black and white. Or if he's a Muslim, all of a sudden his pants are short, right? All of a sudden his pants are short, and he's wearing who knows what on his head, and he's got and all of a sudden he looks like he's from 18th century Afghanistan, and how did that happen? Last week, he looked like an investment banker, and this week, he looks like you know, um, so those kinds of we have to be very careful not to be too into those kinds of changes. I think that could be, and if you're teaching other people, like I think it's a big mistake to emphasize that with people. I think when we start, we should really start with the internals first. And that's my personal. So that's where I am with that. What do you think?
It's a very valid and balanced understanding that you've presented, uh, and I understand where it is coming from. However, I would want to tell you from my experience that this appearance, you know, thing, which is a form of religious symbolism, um, makes people distinguished from others and belong to a certain group, which has its own merits, but it also has some real problems, as you rightly pointed out. I mean, you appearing to belong to a certain group is a merit for some people because they're kind of lost
Hmm.
if they do not have a sense of identity. Uh, Particularly when you begin to be inclined towards religion. Um, you are not you're not somebody who is welcomed by people. Uh, you know, People who are more into worldly matters, they're not they're not very excited to see somebody like inclining towards more religiosity. So you need to have the support of others available with you, and that causes people to start looking for identities and to belong to groups. But then obviously there is the flip side of it that when you belong to one group, it is to the at the expense of others.
Right.
Uh, People start feeling that we are different from others, which is most certainly not what the true spirit of religion, what our God wants us to do. If you allow me, I can tell you from my experience, right at the beginning of my inclination towards religion, I adopted many of those uh, manifestations of appearance, of religiosity, as far as appearance is concerned. You know, covering of head, and well, my beard is decently long even now. But you're talking about shortened pants, and it had two different uh, impacts. One was the one that I was talking about, the positive impact. That most certainly, I became intensely, seriously, deeply religious. You know, uh, but then I also started troubling my family. I I I, I seriously regret, particularly my late mother, who used to be worried. What has gone wrong to him? I mean, he was a normal person. I mean, I could have prayed to my God even without all this baggage, with the disappearance stuff. So, There are both sides to it, and as you rightly pointed out, one needs to be very careful because the negative impact can sometimes nullify, uh, outdo the positive impact that you would want to have through a certain appearance that you go for because of your religious leanings.
That is so I have to tell you that when I first became observant, probably about 35 years ago or 30 years ago, um, my family called me the Ayatollah. That was my nickname. Um, not just because, well, part of it was the appearance, but part of it was also because I just told everybody what to do. I was convinced that I knew better what to do, and I, I'm still paying for that. I still have to like back up from that, and my family still has to forgive me. They've forgiven me, but it was a struggle. Um, but yeah, that's a really it's interesting. So, um. I'm a member of a sect that doesn't believe in uniforms. So we have the rabbi, so back in the 18 end of the 1700s, um all the different Hasidic sects were all like adopting uniforms, right? So they had some special hat, they had this special this and special that. And somebody asked the Rebbe Nachman, they asked our rabbi, they said, well, what should we wear? And he said, don't wear a uniform. He says, wear whatever you want, right? Don't wear a uniform. And they said, why? He says, because if you wear a uniform, you're going to really believe, like, you're going to believe that that makes you something, doesn't make you anything. So, so we wear all sorts of things. So, then you never see like, there's no set hat, there's no set, whatever. But I will tell you, so for years, just on this topic for years, I only wore black and white. Okay, I mean, okay, so it's a religious thing, only black and white. And then um, I started to wear colors, blue. Okay, and I noticed people treated me differently. I mean, people relaxed. It was amazing. All of a sudden, like people relaxed. And then when I added stripes, I added stripes. Then it was like people all of a sudden you could feel people were breathing easier around me. And that's a really important point,
Yeah.
like um and I also noticed it's very interesting because I don't wear exactly a uniform, you know. I noticed that sometimes, I'll be in the supermarket and I'll see somebody who has a kippah, and sometimes they'll kind of like, you know, give me the nod. Sometimes they won't, depending upon what they think my uniform means, right? So if I'm wearing a certain kind of hat, if I'm wearing a certain kind of hat, they'll smile at me. If I'm wearing another kind of hat, they won't smile at me. Um, you know, it's very,
It
it's,
is.
it's,
I,
you know,
I agree. I agree. And one of the things that I think happens to be a big disadvantage as far as my experience is concerned, I came across was that when there was religiosity evident from your appearance, it would, as you rightly pointed out, it would all of a sudden put off many people.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And the end result would be this big disadvantage that why you would want to talk to these people to bring them closer to the same message that has impacted you because of your appearance, they would not even want to communicate with you.
right,
So, that's I see as probably the biggest disadvantage. But on the other hand, I must admit that when I look back uh, at the first, let's say, 10, 15 years of my transformation, I have a feeling that probably it would not have been quite as strong and lasting as it turned out to be then, had it not been my peculiar attire and appearance. So,
Right.
to find a balance is really difficult, and to to give a verdict as to whether one strategy or the other is uh, is more important, is more um, likely to give better results. So, I mean, the most elusive thing that you can uh, have is balance. It just doesn't happen. You're either drawn towards one extreme or the other.
Right.
It needs to be something that's somewhere in the middle, wherein you're trying to reap the advantages of looking, appearing uh, conservative or religious,
Right.
but then without the accompanying disadvantages, which I'm sure that they're there.
Yeah. Well, there's also, my uh one of my bosses once noticed. He said the thing that's weird about you is that you're so surprisingly normal. Means mean to say that, I at that time I also looked more religious, right? Big hats and whatever, so, I full black coat and whatever. And he said, but you to see you, you wouldn't think you spoke English, like to say, would be, uh, and the fact that I do speak English, that I have a pretty normal, a good secular education and so forth, that, all of that, all that was surprising, all that was surprising. And so that worked in my favor in certain respects, because you say, oh, this guy, okay, he looks like this, but he's, relatively normal. I can talk to him. He knows about the world. He's been other places. He has, he's, he's not as closed-minded as he looks. But the wall sometimes that could go up, was also, palpable. I mean, there are times I experienced that, even in the supermarket, even in the supermarket. I've had people, like, um, avoid me in the supermarket because they don't want me to see what's in their shopping cart, because they're afraid I'm going to judge what they eat. I mean, really, literally, I've seen them. They run away from me because they're afraid that I'm gonna see, I'm gonna see the bacon in their shopping cart, and I'm gonna criticize them. I'm gonna start yelling at them or something. Which, of course, that I don't
Yeah,
bother people. You know,
there is this advantage of being stigmatized. You know, uh, there is somebody else who has committed a serious crime by, assaulting somebody, saying something extremely evil, and the person has the same appearance, attire as yours, and it's because of somebody else's fault, you are also going to be seen to have the same kind of personality. Because people generalize. I mean, people uh,
yeah,
don't don't go into those details. I mean, your boss had the advantage of being in your company
right,
most of the time,
right,
so he was an exception.
right.
But anybody who did not know you from close would have a very different opinion. And the very fact that he mentioned that, uh, you you are a strange person. I mean, it's very surprising.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very fair point, and especially, especially because, and again, you know, unfortunately, unfortunately, a lot of I don't know. When religious people do bad things, they're much more visible, you know.
Yeah,
They're very, very visible. And it's also it's visible, and it's the hypocrisy is palpable, right? The hypocrisy is palpable. So, you know, it happens unfortunately a lot, right? It's not unusual. So you see a guy arrested and he's wearing exactly the same thing that I wear. And it's like, okay, well, you know, that happened quite a lot, and people's expectations of you also, you know, people, I was on an airplane. I was on an airplane, and there was a there's a young lady. She was sitting down, and the guy and there was a big ruckus in the airplane because the Hasidic guys didn't want to sit next to women, right, on the airplane. And they're yelling and screaming and moving and this and that, and the flight won't leave, right? The flight can't leave because they won't sit down, because they won't sit next to the woman, and they're trying to figure this out and everything, and everything else. And I was so embarrassed. I was so embarrassed that I didn't know what to do. Finally, there was one guy. I said, uh, uh, I just said, just sit over there. I just sit over there. I'll sit here. Okay, it's okay. And he said, oh, you must be a Baal Tshuva. You must be a returner, right? Somebody who wasn't always religious. I said, yes. Okay, I can handle sitting next to this person. I'm not going to lose my control. I think I can handle this. It's not. But literally, we waited for, and it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing because the behavior was inappropriate for an airplane and for that situation. What are they going to do? They can't move everybody in the airplane because you have, you're, you know, should have thought that before if that's your problem.
that's right. Uh, You know, you mentioned towards the beginning of your presentation regarding the head covering and the fact that you know kind of at times symbolizes for the presence of God and reminds you of it. That's fine. That's great. But I would think that if whatever religious tradition I belong to, if there is a solid reason within the text for one to adopt a certain appearance, then obviously it all depends on how clearly and strongly emphasized it is, and then no questions asked. However, if it's not quite as clearly explicitly mentioned, and it's left to the individual's discretion, then I think you ought to look at the pros and cons of coming up with some religious appearance which is going to cause you to look different from others. Because as I said earlier, I mean, I think one important expectation of uh, God from us is that as we have found religion important for our own selves, we should try to introduce it to others. I think to me, uh, that happens to be far more important than uh, me looking like some people and not like others. Uh, and as yet, I mean, obviously, we can always change our opinions. As yet, I have a feeling that it's far more possible for you to be able to mingle with what we might call the common people,
Mhm.
you know, when we look similar to them, rather than when we are different. And when we are different and we appear to be more religious, although I know that there are some people who give more respect. And maybe if you talk to them, they might be more attentive. But in most cases, what I find is that even though they might actually seem to be respectful towards you, they have these reservations, kind of, if not scared, they're hesitant to be uh, as open with you as you would want them to be. If a real, genuine dialogue, exchange of views is to take place, which is so very essential otherwise for the religious message to be communicated properly.
Yeah. I, I wanted to address something that is important with the head covering and all that. It's also, these things are also gang signs, which is the other, and that becomes a whole different, that creates a whole different set of, I mean, that's a whole different set of problems, right? You know, because once you're a member of one gang, right, there's all these competitions and all of that. But yeah, I agree with you. It's people can be attentive. One of the things I try to emphasize, in my teaching is, I want people to think, and I want people, but they don't have to think like me. Spirituality of all things is not, sometimes we buy clothes and, you buy them off the rack, ready made, right? And other times you have to have them tailored. Spirituality always has to be tailored, right? What's good for one person is not good for another person. And as you said, I think, for me also, I think that my kind of development of kind of going through a phase of doing all that, I think was very healthy for me. I think it was what I needed, but I would not necessarily recommend it for someone else. And for someone else, let's say, for example, covering your head, it's a strong custom, but it is a custom. It's not law, right? And if so somebody says to me, this is not something that makes me comfortable. I don't doesn't give feel anything, you know, uh, in the community there where I live here, most of them are Moroccans, and their custom is not to cover their head all the time. That's not their custom. So you have people who are very religious, right? There are people who are very religious. They come and they pray every day, and and they don't cover their head all the time. They cover when they pray, when they eat, but other than that, they don't. And so for that person, I would say this is not the most important thing for you. This is not it's not, it's not an essential. It's not an essential. And so if this is not going to be something that's going to make you uncomfortable, and you're going to make you feel distant from other people and going to make difficulties for you, then but but on each person on their on their basis. um
That's fine, but the one last thing that I would mention is that uh, although it has its merits, yet I find that in case of many religious groups, you mentioned that I agree with you that it would vary from person to person, and one must select, opt for it or not, depending upon our circumstances and the kind of impact it would have on us. However, I must admit that many people, uh, they appear what the way they look, at least after a while, not for their own good, not for their own sake, but for others.
right,
They would fear that if they would change their appearance, there
right,
is going to be a reaction from others, and
right.
that is what keeps them the way they are. So that is again a very problematic reason for one to appear in a peculiar way.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see this all the time. People who really, their insides have changed, but they're afraid of they're afraid of what other people are going to think. They're afraid of, the repercussions and social responses and things like that. Yeah, that's definitely there. Um, yeah, it's and it's remarkable. And I would also say, it's interesting to think about the uniforms and, you know, part of the problem of belonging to something like this, right? Of kind of expressing that kind of belonging, is it also has an impact on the way you think, and I think that being tied to a particular way of thinking and a particular way of doing, I think can often cut you off from avenues that, cut you off from avenues that, um, somebody said to me recently, you know, I was asking them like, I guess I was trying to ask them kind of, what kind of Jew are you? I guess that was the kind of that was the essential question I was asking. And he said to me, he said, I think, but he says, I study with the rationalists, but I pray with the mystics. That's what he said. And I thought to myself, well, that makes a lot of sense, right? It makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, because praying with the mystics, right, you're going to get a lot more energy and it's going deeper, right? But their study and their learning is going to be very different, right? But and he likes the rationalist approach. And I thought to myself, I said, that's a great answer. You
Yeah.
know, but but that answer is not going to work if you identify yourself as either one. If you say, I'm a rationalist, I'm a mystic, I'm this, I'm that, whatever, it's not going to work. You're not going to be able to do that. But that's a great solution. I mean, I thought that's 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 a great answer. That sounds like it would work. Uh, and I would say that would be my answer at the moment too, I would say. Um,
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Fine.
I, you know,
Excellent.
I think that's a reasonable place to be for the moment. So
Good.
we're
Excellent.
we're up against time, so I think we did good.
Yeah, that's right.
I
We're
think we
done
did,
decently. Yeah, that's right.
I think we did good. So next
Thank
week
you.
you're on.
I'm on.
Next week you're on.
I
Okay.
am.
You have a week.
Certainly.
Thank you so, so,
Thank you
so
very
much.
Thank you very
Every time it's always a pleasure to see you.
Absolutely. Same
This
here.
is
Same here.
this is
Thank
one
you
of
very much.
the best parts of my week. So,
Absolutely. I always look forward to it. Thank you very much.
okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye bye.